Hi, my name's Dave Miller. I'm the Chief Security Officer for Covisint, and today what I want to talk about is this idea of automated manufacturing, really kind of the rise of the machines, right? So, how industrial equipment's going to join the supply chain as opposed to just be basically a tool of the supply chain. So this is kind of the connected things slide that really talks about the billions and billions of things, right? Every presentation has this kind of billions and billions slide. But if you think about it, it wasn't that many years ago that we really didn't have a lot of connected things. The stuff that was connected in our lives was our computer, right? We've moved to things like our cell phone being connected. But now you're getting more and more stuff that is connected. So it started kind of in the area related to consumers. So we've got connected light bulbs, and I think there's a connected crock pot these days. But now we're moving into things like manufacturing. So, and manufacturing's always had automation, but we're getting more and more of that automation being connected. So instead of there just being robots, instead of there just being inventory management, what you have is you have connected inventory that's connected to your logistics system, that's connected basically to the robots, it's connected to the engineering systems that decide what it is built and how things are built. And if you take a look at this, it's becoming more and more and more. So a single plant can have hundreds, maybe thousands of connected items. And as you can see, right, the graph becomes almost exponential, right, from a standpoint of how it goes up. So as I said, it started kind of with the whole CE stuff, right? So consumer electronics, it was really that first wave where it was connected from the home, right? It was your camera, it was your phone, it was your home, right? Maybe your refrigerator. But we really have gotten into this whole idea of networked industries. And so networked industries is this idea where, to build a car, for example, right? It's not just one company, right? It's that company, it's those suppliers interacting, right? And nowadays we have something called just in time, which basically means the parts come to the plant exactly when it's needed. So how is it that you get that to work as efficiently as possible? So those parts come at the exact last second, right? So that those things allow you to reduce total amount of inventory, reduce exactly the way things are logistically sent in order for you to be able to kind of turn that around a lot bigger, right? So it's bigger than just automotive, right? It really is this connected world, right? It's basically the new way of not just us living, but it really is the new way of us manufacturing. It's the new way of us assembling and interacting, not just in our normal lives, but really in our business lives. So in this connected world, right, we have a set of expectations, right? So this is what's expected in this whole idea of Internet of Things, right? It has to be easy, right? Meaning that I can't have a huge IT staff that's going to be able to have to do this. It has to be fast, right? We've gotten into this idea that when I bring a new thing in, right? So I buy a new car, right? I have a new logistics channel, right? It basically auto finds itself, right? I turn it on and it is instant, right? Obviously, it has to be relevant. I think we've gotten to the point now where it just being kind of fast and shiny isn't good enough, right? So it has to be relevant, right? And then what you need is it needs to remove hassles, right? And obviously, it has to add value, right? But what are we getting? Right? We're getting complex setup. So really, we have a significant amount of complexity every time you bring something in, because there's a lot of issues associated with the fact that nothing talks the same language, nothing talks the same protocols, so that's difficult, right? It's a lot of delays, so it takes a lot of time to get your new inventory system, right, or your new value chain system, or your new manufacturing system connected in, right? It can take years sometimes, right? It's very disconnected communications, so you've got kind of a disconnected item, right? Ends up being more hassles. And in the end, it's very hard to decide if there's really value or is there not value. And so, we have to kind of get from that what you get to really what's expected. So how do we do that, right? So how can we really create this extensive connectivity, and how do we achieve it in a way that is easy to do? So one of the things here that we look at Covisint is this idea, right, of identity, right, and security. Now, obviously, I'm the security guy, and so I'm going to talk about security, but identity of the things is important because we know all of the things that these things have to do, right? So for example, right, you have to be able to personalize. So as you bring something in, every organization is going to want to do it differently, right? So there's going to be things like, you know, if you look at consumer electronics, things like radio presets, right? But if you're taking a look at connected factories, right, it's going to be the presets that factory wants, right? The way that they want that to do. Triggers become hugely important. So when you have thousands and thousands of monitoring things, right, that basically are tracking your inventory, that are tracking your logistics, right, the ability for those triggers to not only be created but to be able to be consumed, right, is really important, right? Access management, right, so once you have this connected factory and once you have this connected manufacturing, you're going to have to be able to log in. You're going to have people who are going to have to be able to get in, go to one place, and be able to access those items. And the things are going to have to be able to access really the network. So it's the idea that a thing has identity, right? That the thing can be audited, right? The thing can be monitored. So those things really are access management, right? Identity lifecycle is something that nobody thinks about. So the idea is, right, you bring a new device into the plant, that new device basically connects itself and starts doing things, and that's great, right? But what happens when I decide I want to remove that? So now I've decided that I'm going to buy an upgraded set of items, right? Maybe I'm going to sell the whole plant. How do I deprovision those items, right, in such a way so they're not still connected to my ecosystem, they're connected to the new person's ecosystem, right? And then this idea of unlimited integration, right? So the ability to be able to integrate those items, not just into my corporate area, but maybe my e-commerce, right? Maybe actually being able to integrate those into my supply chain directly. So that's the ability, for example, for my inventory to be able to be shared with my suppliers so they know exactly when to update those inventories. So this is all great, and you know, we talk a lot with a set of slides that have things in it, but I kind of like to at least kind of tell a story about how we could see this working, right? So if you look at what happens in manufacturing, and we're going to use automotive manufacturing for this example, right? It's a tiered system, right? So we obviously know that in the end there's OEMs, right? And then they are supplied by tier ones, and tier ones are supplied by tier twos, right? And then there's actually the folks who actually provide the original raw materials, right? So if you look at the story about how a car gets created, for example, right? It starts with things like rolled steel. So what you have is a set of steel, right, that is sitting somewhere, and this is inventory. So that steel is waiting to basically be inventoried somewhere. If you take a look at, after that, if you take a look at what has to happen, right, you're looking at logistics. So think about it, right? So the steel is produced in one spot, right? At the time that those sets of parts are needed to be made, right? That information, not that information, that material has to actually be sent somehow. So now what I'm doing is I'm bringing another group into it, right? A logistics group that actually has to be able to send that information. At that time, what ends up happening is we're back to an inventory system again, right? So if you think about it, right? So we're talking raw materials, right, that are being sent via a logistics provider that then get inventoried somewhere. And oftentimes these plants aren't or these inventory warehouses aren't even owned by the tier 2 or the tier 1. So in those cases, right, it's inventoried by another third party. So now we've got 3 different companies that have to work to be able to get this far. At that point in time, right, based upon some sort of pull signal, right, you've basically got to pull that inventory off for basically the purpose of being able to do something with it. And that really requires a set of in-depth inventory management. So I have to know where that inventory is. I have to know where that inventory goes. I have to figure out the method by which I'm going to get it there. And if you take a look at assembly, right, it's not one thing that I use to build things. I have to bring basically 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 things together at the same time, right? And then I have the manufacturing. So now I've basically taken that item and I've basically created it into some sort of subassembly. So think about it again, right? So it is raw material, it is logistics, it is inventory, and then it is the manufacturing process that now gets me some sort of subassembly. If you look at it, now we're going to go back to the same thing, right? Subassemblies then have to go back to another logistics provider, oftentimes a very different company. So when you're talking about large raw materials, right, you're probably talking about freight trains, you're probably talking about ships, right? In many cases, now you're going to talk about a trucking company, right? So now this is logistics to get a subassembly someplace. At which point in time that subassembly once again gets inventoried. So now I have another set of inventory management where basically now I need to know where that information is. And then I basically have to take that and I put that together into the final assembled item, right? So I'm doing manufacturing, or in this case it's really assembly, right? So we've started with raw materials, we've gone through logistics, we've gone through manufacturing, we've gone through logistics, we've gone through inventory, and now we're going through assembly. But that's not where it ends. We're going to go through logistics again. So people don't go to the factory to buy their cars. In the end, what ends up happening is those cars then get shipped somewhere again. And right, so this could be a car hauler. So now I have another logistics company that basically is involved. And what happens with those cars is, in the end, they get put in inventory. So they are in an inventory lot. Maybe that's at the dealership, right? Now, in the perfect world, the way that this would work is the ability is that as soon as this vehicle leaves the dealership lot, a pull signal goes back through all of those things that I explained before. So that vehicle leaves the dealership lot, which requires then a logistics provider to deliver a new vehicle, which requires the OEM to manufacture a new vehicle, which requires the logistics provider to bring all the parts to manufacture that vehicle, which provides a pull signal to the end raw material supplier to be able to provide the raw materials that do that, right? So, and the more we can shorten that up, right? We've talked for years and years and years about being able to shorten the supply chain time, right? The more responsive that we can be to customers' needs, right? So the more that we can increase quality, for example, because when you find a defect, you don't have a whole ton of inventory that sits in the system, right? That's what we're talking about, the ability. But as I was talking before, right, we're talking about this being an interaction between dealerships, between warehouses, between multiple logistics providers, plus the OEM, the tier 1, the tier 2, and the raw material provider. So this either requires lots of people, right, which is somewhat inefficient, right, or it requires a lot of things that can basically be able to communicate to each other in a secure way to provide that very, very shortened supply chain. So how is it that we do this, right? So the problem is, as all of these things basically connect, right, I have to create a system to connect them all. And if you do this the way that everybody thinks about doing it, it is a direct connection. So it is the fact that the dealership would know that the raw materials need to be done, right? The coordination would happen everywhere. And as we all know, right, the more connections you have, the more difficult it is to manage, the more difficult it is to be able to secure, right? The more difficult it is to set up. And if you remember all those, what we're looking for easy, we're looking for fast, we're looking for secure, right? We're looking for something that has relevance immediately. And this makes life very, very difficult if you do point to point. The answer to that is this idea of what we would call a hub. So instead of a mesh network, which is what we were talking about before, right, we're really going to do a hub and spoke network. So what this really is this idea of, imagine everything connected to a central spot. That central spot kind of is the traffic cop, right, or the orchestrator, if you want to take a look at it that way, to orchestrate the interaction between all of these things. It knows what things can interact with other things, right? It knows that, for example, the dealership can order more cars, but the dealership can't order more steel. All right, so it's the tier 2 that may order the steel. It gives you a central place to be able to manage triggers. It gives you a central place to authenticate to be able to manage all the items that you have to manage in this very, very complex supply chain, right? And this is just the tip of the iceberg on the number of things, right? So, you know, it's not 20 items, right? It's 2,000 items that have to work together. So what are the challenges, right? And even in this hub and spoke model, right, there are certainly challenges to doing this, right? So first off, without this hub and spoke model, right, complexity builds exponentially, right? So what does that mean? Well, so if you think about everything connecting to everything directly, then the difference in the number of connections between 10 and 11 is 100. It's 10 times 10, right? The difference in the number of connections between 11 and 12 is 11 times 11. Right? In a hub and spoke model, right, those things don't go exponentially. The difference between 10 and 11 is 1, right? So that becomes much, much easier, right? More endpoints, greater vulnerability. So, you know, you can see this in your house, right? If I have 20 windows in my house, that's 20 places for people to break in, right? So the more places that somebody can connect, right, the greater the vulnerability, right? If you're talking about things that are privacy associated, so if you're talking about connecting things that maybe are not business related, or maybe it's the privacy of your industry, right, which is really things like intellectual property, then privacy is jeopardized by each transaction. So you want to minimize the number of transactions. I don't want, for example, to expose my tier 2 directly to the OEM, perhaps, right? I want the tier 1 in between it. So that privacy gets jeopardized, right? Adding or removing things is risky because it breaks the whole connected model. So in a hub and spoke model, right, when you add and remove things, they're removed from the ecosystem as one thing. When you add or remove things in a mesh model, you could actually break the communication that occurs between other things, right? And it's really set up for self-destruction, right? As data mounts, as endpoints mount, it becomes more and more and more complex. And in the end, what you get is a system that nobody's really sure how it works anyway, because there's way too many connections to manage, and there's no single place to be able to go to be able to view those connections. So we've talked about this idea of a centralized rules engine, right? So, and certainly the internet or the cloud is really the place to put that, right? So a central place to connect, we know how to connect to a central place, right? And some of the best practices that we've looked at here on how you do those things, right? We've kind of tried to put them into 4 kind of high-level best practices. So the first thing is this idea of trust but verify. The idea is the identity of not just the right person, but the right device. So I need to know that that inventory system, right, which, by the way, could be a set of pallets that are sitting somewhere, is the right set of pallets. I need to know that the truck that is picking it up is from the right, is coming from the right place and going to the right place. That is all about managing identity, right? Having a single place to present and integrate all of the data, right, in an easy, consumable manner, not just consumable based on consumable by people, right? So it's good to have a single place to log in to manage this ecosystem, but consumable by the things themselves. One place to connect to easily consume all of the information that they need, right? The less lines is better thing is something that I've been talking about in this whole idea of having a hub, right? So if you remember that diagram that was there before, this whole idea of having lots and lots and lots of lines becomes much, much more complex. And if you have a central hub, you have less lines, right? And then the ability of being completely open, right? And what that means is, right, when people talk open, they always talk about open standards, but that means also supporting closed standards. The ability to allow any technology to connect, whether it's a closed standard or an open standard, you're going to have to do that, or you're going to have to live in kind of a walled garden, right? I have to pick from all one technology, and I don't want to have to do that. I want to be able to pick from multiple technologies. I want to be able to migrate to new technologies. So this ability to allow any technology to connect is very important. So what we've kind of created here, right, and what we've created at Covisint is this ability to have this single communication architecture, right, that connects manufacturing, right? So it's really an interoperability framework, and that's an old word, interoperability, but it still fits, right? It's this idea of being able to interoperate across everywhere. So I don't really care if it's the plant or the phone that is connecting, or the robot that's connecting, or the inventory system that's connecting, right? That can be connected through a set of standard API services, right? Those same integrations allow third parties, allow telematics information that comes from logistics, allow all of those things to be able to connect. And then it's a single place to go for the worker to be able to manage all of these things. So what we're going to have is we may end up having the things do a lot of the work that used to be done by people, but you still have the people who are going to have to manage those items to make sure that everything is on track, to make sure that the inventory levels are appropriate, to make sure that the manufacturing is happening appropriately, to really to manage this system. And nobody wants to have to log into 15 different areas, right? So the ability to put all this together in one spot to allow people to easily look at all of the information related to this is going to be really important. So in summary, right, let's, if you really think about it, right, so this complexity for connected things is going to increase. There's no way to get around the fact that we're going to have more and more connected things, not just in our lives, right, but in our businesses today, right? It's the way that we're going to become more efficient, right? This future is today. We're here right now, right? This isn't a future that we're talking about in 20 years, right? The manufacturing industry already has a significant amount of these things, right? There are going to be different brands and manufacturers, right? So we're going to have the ability to be able to pick from lots and lots of different manufacturers. We see this today just with cell phones, right? So you pick different brands. Am I an Apple guy or am I an Android guy, right? And we all know that Apple and Android don't communicate very well. And in your personal life, you may be able to say, I've decided I'm an Apple guy, I'm just going to buy Apple stuff. But in the business world, I want to be able to buy the best of breed across things, and there's going to be access changes, and we're going to need some way to connect that up, right? Today, it is still time-consuming to set up those connections, so it takes a long time to set this up. And we know that enterprises are looking for ease of use and speed to value, right? It's about how quickly can I get to the value of some new system, right? And we also know that organizations that ignore this and decide that they're not going to do connected devices, right, are going to be the losers, right? And those who do adopt this cloud-based connectivity are going to win over their competitors. So how is it we get started, right? What are the things that we think, need to be done as a starting point, right? So first off, right, so identify your points for connecting your supply chain, right? Where are the places you're already automated? And what are the things that if you could connect them to each other would be the best place for you to be able to get efficiency, right? Mobilizing and connecting your key supply chain processes within your organization. So we don't have to have this connected everything to everything, right? Find the items that are perhaps the most expensive items that you want to keep the least amount of inventory of, right? So that you can do those key supply chain items and processes first, right? Putting an infrastructure in for security, right, which really includes management of the identity, is important at the beginning. We oftentimes have a tendency to secure things after we build them. We build them first to do the thing, and then we think about security afterwards. In today's world, where there's a lot of bad guys out there that are looking to be able to disrupt things, right, we really need to make security the building block that we build upon and build it right from the beginning, right? Find the low-hanging fruit, right, to promote your success, right? If inventory management is your problem and you have an automated inventory system, maybe that's the area of connectivity that allows you to do the first things, right? As I said before, enterprises are looking for the ability to get quick value, right? And if you're implementing things and you can't get the value quickly, sometimes they lose interest in your project. So find those items that really promote success easily, right? Once things are in order, right, in one area, then you can tackle the larger, right? So this is a building block sort of thing, right? Don't try to plan for everything at once, right? Find that low-hanging fruit, right? Put your room in order, as it were, right, before you try to tackle the whole house. And the machines are there, right? We know that the ability to track things, right? We know that logistics providers have the ability to track vehicles and vehicle location. We know that there's automated inventory management. It is all there, right? It is really now time for them to be able to earn what they do, and instead of being kind of in their own silo, to really open them up to be able to do and connect across your organization to be able to make you more efficient. So I hope you've learned something from this. Certainly feel free to reach out to Covisint if you have more information that you'd like, and I'd like to thank you for your time.